So we're talking again with Israeli socialist and Palestinian rights anti-apartheid activist Ofer Neiman. So it's great to talk with you again, Ofer.
Thanks, John.
So first, let's just start, no big protest movement of massive mobilization in the streets can continue indefinitely. So how are things going right now? Are things starting to die down, or are the protests still just as big and just as intense?
So the protests are going strong. It's August. Some people are on vacation. And perhaps for now, when there's no major sort of specific clash around a piece of legislation, perhaps we're not going to see the main roads in Tel Aviv getting blocked, but the protests are going strong. And beyond that, things are coming to a head with refusal by pilot reservists, Air Force reservists, and various reservists of so-called elite IDF units. And this is something which will make headlines because it creates a problem for the Netanyahu government, for the military, a so-called preparedness problem. The IDF chief of staff will no longer be able to say that the IDF is fully prepared for any eventuality, a coming war, etc. And this is a big deal. People are going to talk about it, and we're already seeing that some people on the right wing are accusing even the IDF chief of staff of sort of caving in to the reservists. And this in itself will mean that the protests are not going away. And another thing is that there's probably a great deal of momentum to keep them going, at least after the Supreme Court hears petitions against the first so-called reform bill that has already been passed, the one about the reasonableness clause, not allowing the Supreme Court to revoke, to annul government decisions, saying that they are not unreasonable. There's a petition to the High Court of Justice against the constitutionality of this law, and the court will have to hear and decide on that. And this creates another incentive for the protesters to go on. Another thing is that the general behavior of the Netanyahu government, it's full of extremists and religious fanatics and so on. So just ongoing actions, statements by ministers are more than enough to keep the rift going. As an anecdote, we can add that there is a certain attempt right now, especially ahead of the Jewish holidays, New Year and Yom Kippur, a day of forgiveness, it's atonement, forgiveness, on the part of some right-wing figures to sort of strive for unity and organize various events, a music festival, things like that, for unity. I don't think it's going to go down well with the protesters. They will not be pacified. Yeah.
So it seems to me that what's happened over the longer term is that the extreme right kind of developed out of the whole process of building the settlements and strengthening the settlers in the West Bank. And so I have two questions flowing from that. First is, do you agree with that? And second is the protest against this extreme right-wing government, is there any tendency to start to look at what is the basis, which it seems to me that the whole project of the settlements and maybe annexing the West Bank, that's really the origins, the basis of it. Is there any tendency to look at that?
Yeah, so the origins of this reform, the coup, are indeed in the settler movement. The leaders, the main think tank. So the leaders are either settlers or hard right-wing Likudniks. The main think tank behind this reform is pro-settlers. So yeah, the main objective here is to cement the occupation, the settlements, to make it easier for Israel to control the lives of the Palestinians. However, these people have developed an appetite for more than that. They're also waging a war against the so-called older Israeli elites, the more secular Tel Aviv type liberal Zionist elites. They think they're powerful enough to replace the old elites, or just gain momentum within that struggle. Perhaps even a touch of vindictive politics here around events in the past, such as the disengagement, the so-called disengagement, Israel pulling out of Gaza in 2005, and the way it was promoted by the center and the Zionist, the liberal left, the liberal Zionist. But the main thing, the main objective is what they have in mind is occupation. So of course you would ask, I mean, are the protesters, the Israeli protesters against the coup, are they noticing that? And the answer would be increasingly so. Increasingly so. More and more people are talking about the occupation, the settlers, settler violence, the pogroms and the attacks on Palestinian villages in the West Bank. There seems to be a certain disconnect between quite a few ordinary people who are going to these protests and the main organizers. The main organizers are unwilling to add the occupation to the whole discussion. We've had some really childish, ridiculous statements. One of them, a physics professor, Shikma Blesler, saying that this has nothing to do with the occupation, or even beyond that, saying there is an occupation or there isn't an occupation, just beyond that, just saying that maybe there isn't even an occupation. She was saying no, and her reason was because look at Hungary, Poland, and other countries where the right wing is waging a political war with reforms, far-reaching reforms, and there is no occupation there, which is a silly claim, because I mean, of course, in every country, the right wing has its own agenda, but it's usually, I mean, the underlying themes are, xenophobia, racism, conservatism, restricting women, gender minorities, and so on. And another one, a guy, a high-tech professional, he couldn't utter the word occupation. He gave an interview and he was only able to say something like controlling other people or something like that, and calling it a problem, but sort of resisting any attempts to really talk about the occupation, use the word per se, add it to the narrative. But I think there's much more open-mindedness among ordinary people who are going to these demonstrations, and this will create more and more pressure from the grassroots, from below, to address the occupation.
So these people that you mentioned, what are their political connections?
These two prominent organizers.
Well,
right?
them and the others who were is there any general trend as far as the...
Yeah, these are, you could say, liberal Zionist, mostly Ashkenazi. There are quite a few Mizrahis as well, but mostly Ashkenazi, more secular leaning Israelis, mostly living in central Israel, in the greater Tel Aviv area. There's a strong cultural divide here. There's a real rift here along religious, cultural, sort of geographical lines here. And these people typically do not vote for Likud or for the pro-settler parties or for the ultra-Orthodox parties, of course. They vote for the center parties, such as Yair Lapid's party or Benny Gantz's party. Some of them vote for the Labor Party, which is now much weaker than it used to be. And yeah.
So you sent me a really interesting article, which, as I understand it, my interpretation of it is that Israel, like Israeli kind of political culture, is built around a holy trinity of the Holocaust, the fallen, the fallen heroes, you could say, and the IDF, the Israeli military, and that the IDF is really in a sense in crisis right now. And you know, if it's correct to call that like a holy trinity, that's a triangle, and a triangle is strong in geometry and in I guess you could say in architecture. But once one leg of that triangle goes away, the whole thing collapses. So, is that a correct analysis or explanation of that article? And would you comment on it?
Yeah, that's correct. The military here is sacred, perhaps even more so to liberal Zionist Israelis. It's perceived as a unifying element, as something that should be beyond any political conflict. Very ironic that throughout the years, when we, meaning the small population here of dissidents, small constituency of dissidents, anti-Zionist, anti-apartheid, who were promoting refusal to serve in the military because of violations of Palestinian rights. That's the main reason, the best reason for refusal. The liberal Zionists didn't like that. They said, this is terrible, you shouldn't refuse, it's illegal, you should go to prison, it's morally wrong. Yet here they are refusing in large numbers. And this is breaking bonds within Israeli society. It's going to be much harder to say that, you know, the military has nothing to do with politics. It's going to be harder to say that everyone should, that it's super important to serve in the military. Everyone has to serve because we need all this military might in order to defend ourselves. How can you say that when you're calling for refusal? You know, when pilots are not showing up for their weekly or monthly training sessions. Yeah, and I think that this is even more difficult in a way for the anti-reform constituency, because if they don't have a religious agenda, the settlers and their supporters, they have a religious political agenda. So of course they want to see a strong Israeli military, but they have other things that from their own perspective can be the glue that holds Israeli society together. You know, the Torah, the biblical thinking, the idea of greater Israel. The liberal, more secular crowd doesn't have that. And if they lose this thing with the IDF as something sacred that is keeping us all together, it's going to be more, they will need to look for a new political path.
But it seems like well, let's put it this way. They're looking for a middle of the road political path, is what I'm gathering. But it seems like the middle of the road is closed off, that the extremes, well, in this sense, that trying to maintain capitalist democracy in Israel, while at the same time accepting the occupation in the West Bank, that's not real. That's becoming increasingly impossible.
Yeah, it's not going to have to. It's not going to work. They will have to come to terms with the fact that there's a brutal occupation here, that they cannot really sort of roll back the political power of the right wing, the nominal right wing in Israel, until they address at least the '67 occupation. As you know, people like me also have a great deal of criticism against Zionism and things that happened in '48 and even before '67. But reality will force mainstream Israelis, anti-coup Israelis to um, start talking about the occupation. I mean, there's no going back. There's no going back to the so-called good old days, even before '67, when the Labor Party ruled Israel, not Likud, and everything was sort of allegedly or seemingly more tolerant, which it was not, but that's their fantasies. It was more secular, not more tolerant. There's no going back. And when this sinks in, interesting things will happen. I mean, I do wonder if the protest movement will maintain the same momentum as an anti-occupation movement. But even if it doesn't, I think that we're already seeing larger numbers of anti-occupation protesters within the major rallies. More and more people are willing to join the small blocks within the larger protests, the blocks where people hold Palestinian flags rather than Israeli flags, or hold up banners with anti-occupation slogans. So at least we have that. I think we're going to have more anti-occupation activists joining the struggle in the near future, and the ball is going to keep rolling. We'll see how it develops.
I remember a few years ago, there was big protests around the housing crisis in Israel. I think it was around the time of the Arab Spring, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, the summer of 2011.
Yeah, and obviously the question of wages, jobs, and so on is also connected to the housing crisis. So I'm wondering, is there any tendency to raise those issues and to connect them with the other issues that we're talking about?
Yeah, so that protest movement began and fizzled in the summer of 2011. And at that time, it was about the high cost of living in Israel, housing for sure, but also as well as other elements of the economy here. So cost of living in general. And at that time, some of us here, the so-called radicals, of course, we were trying to add occupation and apartheid, the anti-occupation and anti-apartheid discourse to what the movement was saying. And success was quite limited. This time, it's not really about the cost of living. Is the Israeli economy doing better right now? I don't know. It's doing fairly well for affluent Israelis. That was the case in 2011 as well. There's quite a lot of poverty here, but right now it's not about the cost of living. Well, I mean, you could say, I mean, that there is. I mean, if there is a judicial coup, it does make sense. I mean, at least if protesters are not the ones suffering from poverty, it's sort of natural for them not to add the cost of living to this issue. And that movement in 2011 was also started by very young people. So that was much more on their mind, cost of living. This movement here is not necessarily a young movement. But back then, and as well as now, we're having problems sort of telling people or convincing people to add the occupation to the discourse. And yeah, so there are lots of ridiculous counter arguments. People telling us that the occupation is a political issue, as if the cost of living is not a political issue, as if the judicial reform is not a political issue. Everything is political, but we often have to face some pretty childish arguments by people who don't want to talk about the occupation.
Well, from what I understand, you said, and that's also my impression from elsewhere, that the main bulk of the protesters are more like middle class Israelis.
And upper class, upper middle class,
Right.
yeah, middle class and beyond.
The ones who would not be feeling the pinch economically. So
yeah.
But obviously it's connected, because from what I understand, Israel is spending a huge amount of money on the settlements. And it's also spending a huge amount of money on the IDF, on the military.
Yeah, so it's, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so it seems to me, well, that to strengthen the movement, wouldn't it strengthen the movement if you brought in a more working class, and especially like more, less wealthy, more impoverished layers? And for them, wouldn't they be feeling the economic issues?
Yeah, so first of all, it's interesting that the protest movement in the summer of 2011 was actually started by young people who were rather Ashkenazi secular liberal, but these were people struggling in Tel Aviv, because Tel Aviv is very expensive. So even if they are for historically more affluent sectors of Israeli society, they were still feeling the heat and saying that Tel Aviv is getting too expensive for us. That was actually used as one of the arguments against the movement, saying these are just, basically just posh people. They don't have to live in Tel Aviv. They can go live elsewhere. But at that time, the movement was joined by protesters across the country from various parts of Israeli society, because this is something that affects lots of Israelis. I think that right now it's going to be very difficult to bring different Israelis together just around the social economic theme, because there is a tribal divide within Jewish Israeli society, and the so-called working class, which is a very problematic definition here for Israel as an apartheid state. But if you look at, Mizrahi Jews from the so-called periphery, and ultra-Orthodox people right now, the parties that they typically vote for are the pro-reform parties. So it's going to be very difficult for these people. It will not come naturally to them to join the anti-reform protests, even if, and that's still not even happening, even if the anti-reform protest adds these various cost of living, social justice issues to its platform. Even if that happens, there's going to be this, cultural, tribal divide within Israeli societies, which can keep more, Likud voters and Orthodox and more religious conservative people away. It's going to be very difficult, but I don't see that happening. If anything, the movement will speak about the occupation, I think, before addressing various cost of living issues, if only for simply understanding the roots of this reform. And as stated previously, we're already seeing more and more people within the protest saying that talking about the occupation, not so much about cost of living, but about the occupation.
Right. Just excuse my ignorance, but is Mizrahi Jews, is that like the same as Sephardic Jews?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. There's this divide where Historically, the Ashkenazi elite was more Labor Party leaning, and Mizrahi Jews in Israel tend to vote for Likud in large numbers. One of the main reasons being harsh discrimination and racism against Mizrahi Jews during the first decades of the State of Israel. So yeah, there's a very strong divide here. Also among, you could say, along ethnic lines, Jews from the Middle East and North Africa versus the Jews from Europe.
Right. And from what I understand, the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, the Iraqi Jews, tend actually to be more anti-Palestinian than the Ashkenazi or European Jews. Is that correct?
It's complicated because the most terrible crimes committed against Palestinians were committed by the Labor Party, people like David Ben-Gurion, Moshe Dayan, in 48 and even in 67 and beyond that. I would say that Mizrahi Jews in Israel have sort of been pushed into doing the dirtiest occupation and apartheid maintenance work. For example, serving in the Israeli border police, which does the daily work of brutally maintaining occupation apartheid on the ground. But, if we want to assign, culpability here, perhaps the people sitting in fancy offices and giving the orders and devising various strategies, racist apartheid strategies, are the main criminals here. So perhaps you see more daily friction when you talk about friction between Palestinians and Israelis, at least when it comes to Israeli police and border police. So you would tend to see more Mizrahi Jews doing the dirty work there. And another thing is that perhaps because Israeli settlements are heavily subsidized, you mentioned that, so who would move to Israeli settlements? People from the lower middle class and from the lower class, because they cannot afford, a nice house in Tel Aviv. So again, you would have large settlements with lots of Mizrahi residents there, and this creates an incentive for these people to support, the settlements and support Likud, and perhaps even endorse harsher rhetoric against Arabs and Palestinians. But if you dig deep, I wouldn't say that these people are inherently more racist towards Palestinians. It's just that their position in Israeli society, which has a lot to do with discrimination, with past discrimination, is sort of pushing them into perhaps a more anti-Palestinian position, at least regarding the 67 issue. Okay, but I would not say that they are inherently more racist. And of course, another thing which is related is that these people have been pushed to sort of repel or do away with their Arab identity, which was looked down upon by the Ashkenazi elite. So one way to do that is to be an ultra-Zionist, a very nationalist Zionist Israeli, who is sort of explicitly anti-Arab. But again, in each of these cases, concerning each of these aspects, I would go back to the roots and say that this has a lot to do with what a very racist, both anti-Palestinian and anti-Mizrahi Ashkenazi Zionist elite did to both Palestinians and Mizrahis.
Well, first of all, I didn't mean to imply that they're inherently more racist.
Yeah, I know. I was just clarifying.
Just that they tended more like to vote for Likud and so on.
Exactly.
But the reason that I wanted to talk to you again, well, number one, just to see how things were developing there, but also I'm working on an article about the political crisis in the United States. And there are huge differences between the United States and Israel, but there's also some similarities. For instance, you could say that the United States is a colonial settler state also, in that when you look at how the United States, how the landmass was settled, a huge, and we shouldn't underestimate this difference, a huge difference is that happened a couple hundred years ago. And it's not still ongoing. And it's not a minority surrounded by a whole bunch of other, like the way Israel is surrounded by Arab states. And so that colonial settler mentality it's not as central in the grip of the consciousness, and not, as it may be in Israel. But anyway, there is that similarity. And but more to the point, I think that just inherently, because of its world position and its history and so on, Israel versus the United States tends to be more stable politically, or I should say less unstable nowadays. But in the instability that we have now, that we're now seeing developing to unprecedented levels, you can see a similarity, in that I think that the overwhelming bulk of the US capitalist class is against the extreme right in the United States. And I have the impression that it's something similar in Israel, that they don't need this law, and they don't want this law that basically cuts out any power of the Israeli Supreme Court.
Yeah. So yeah, they don't want it, and so.
So anyway, just your thoughts on the similarities and differences.
Yeah, there's an even stronger component here, that Israeli citizens who serve in the military would like to maintain this nice fig leaf that we have here in the form of the Israeli Supreme Court, as a protective barrier against indictments by international courts. This is a major thing, and they're actually very explicit about it, saying that we need Israeli Supreme Court because otherwise we may be arrested abroad. And beyond that, there's also liberal Israelis would like to, just like you have liberals and progressives in the US fighting for women's rights, abortion rights, and so on. The liberal sector here in Israel understands that with this judicial reform come that it's not just about the Palestinians, that with this reform they're seeing various attempts and inclinations and statements about rolling back freedoms granted to women, to LGBTQ people, and so on, to make Israel a less tolerant place, even for various groups within Jewish Israeli society. Of course, it's not tolerant when it comes to occupation and apartheid. And this actually, this is quite similar to the struggle in the US, against all these attempts by conservatives and even fascists to, to stop, to revoke reproductive health rights and marginalize women. One interesting example is attempts to allocate separate seats, parts of buses and trains to women. That's actually a policy which some, not all, but some ultra-Orthodox politicians support, saying that women should sit in the back. They should not be seen by the men. Actually, segregation. And so Americans know probably, I mean, a similar form of segregation in public transport comes to mind for Americans who are watching this, Black people having to sit separately from white people. Here, it's mostly about women. And we do have a few segregated buses. Even if it's illegal, they are de facto segregated. Some buses serving ultra-Orthodox communities here. And this is going to be one of the next things that with this appetite for reform, they would like to, the right wing would like to allow, sort of legalize, make these policies more constitutional and prevent the courts from annulling such decisions and such policies. So yeah, so here you see some similarities with current struggles in the US, but also going way back again, because Israel is a settler colonial state in a much more brutal phase than the United States. In some ways, we are like the United States centuries ago. So the legislation and the politics that we see here is going to be more brutal.
So you were talking about the Labor Party and so on. And of course, being a parliamentary system is very different from the United States. But do you see any new party developing which would start to and take up the issue of the occupation, linked with, the questions of democracy within Israel and so on?
Yeah, so actually there is a budding party called Mifleget Kol Ezrachea, the party of all its citizens, related to this slogan that Israel should be a state of all its citizens. Now, you would say, yeah, I mean, why not? That's natural. That's the only thing. But that actually stands in contrast with Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. There's a struggle here, and many Israelis, including some liberal Israelis or self-proclaimed liberal Israelis, reject this notion of a state of all its citizens. They say, no, Israel should be a Jewish democratic state. Actually acknowledging that Jewish and democratic does not mean full constitutional equality. So this new party calls itself the party of all its citizens. And they have this egalitarian agenda for Israel within the 67 borders, and of course they're anti-67 occupation. It's a positive step, and they will probably be competing with the Israeli Labor Party, which by now is a very small party, 4 seats out of 120. It's not the main opposition party, not the main liberal opposition party. And they will also be competing with Meretz, another liberal Zionist party, somewhat to the left of the Labor Party, which is now not represented in parliament. They failed in the recent elections. So we'll see what happens. Personally, I'm not a huge fan because I think that we already have parties mostly representing Palestinian citizens of Israel, and these are the parties we should support. Parties that go beyond this all its citizens agenda and are also speaking of colonialism, criticizing Zionism as a colonial movement, as a settler colonial movement, advocating for decolonization, de-apartheidization. That's what I would like to see. And there's a specific party called Balad, the Jammu, which is led by Palestinian citizens of Israel, but has some Jewish Israeli supporters. That's the party I support. But it's a step forward. It's a step forward. At least we can hold a friendly debate with this new party and challenge them and ask them why they still haven't formulated a comprehensive anti-colonial agenda. If they do run, I hope they take votes from the Labor Party and from the other party I mentioned, Meretz. But I'm not sure that they represent masses of grassroots protesters within the current movement. That's going to be interesting. I mean, the question of how well can they reach out to the masses protesting in Tel Aviv with an Israeli flag, not with a Palestinian flag, and appeal to them. It's an open question because it's still, you know, a new party, small numbers. We'll see what happens.
But from what you're saying, a new party isn't really needed. I mean, there's already an existing party that you yourself support.
Yeah, more than one. And in general, I would just ask these Israelis, mostly Jewish Israelis, to join one of the parties that we already have. It's interesting that one of their arguments against us is saying, look, we're 50% Arab, 50% Jewish. You know, like number one is Jewish on the ballot, number two is Arab or Palestinian, and so on. It's a so-called zipper list, you know, Arab Jew, and so on. I'm not sure I support that. I think that actually, when we have colonialism and occupation, apartheid targeting Palestinian citizens of Israel, it actually makes sense to support parties that are mostly led by Palestinian citizens of Israel. So Jews can join, but there's an issue here. I mean, they think it's a positive thing, 50-50, you know, representation. I think that perhaps it's a part of a problem. That Palestinians should lead the movement, or at least the parties that we're supporting, and we should join these parties as supporters who have a say, but not necessarily, you know, 50-50 leadership roles.
You know what it makes me think of is you say the problem began in 1948.
Even before that, with Zionism.
That's what I was going to get at, is even before 1948, when even before it was even really seriously discussed that Palestine should become an independent state. When labor was organizing in what was then Palestine, at times, I mean, it was focused on organizing the Jewish workers there.
Hebrew labor, the so-called, it's interesting that they were advocating for something called Hebrew labor, avodah ivrit, which is of course a very racist term. I mean, think of a union in the US right now calling for, I don't know, white labor or something like that. That would be terrible.
Right.
But that was the Israeli Labor Party pre-48, and beyond that, they were actually assaulting Arab laborers and driving them, expelling them from the scaffolds, from construction sites.
Right.
So, you know, typical fascism. And nowadays, it's interesting that the ones who are supporting this notion of avodah ivrit, Hebrew labor, that's the Kahanist movement, the extreme religious right wing. They're calling for this, and some of their, you know, you have some, especially in Jerusalem where I live, you know, plumbers, electricians, promoting themselves as Hebrew labor, and there's some opposition to this idea here in Israel. It's considered too racist or too explicitly racist. But yeah, I mean, if you look back, you know, 80, 90, 100 years, that was the Israeli Labor Party doing the same things, perhaps even more brutally, because they were actually assaulting Palestinian laborers.
Yes, but the other part, what I was going to mention was, at times, they did actually organize Arab workers, but the one thing but what they did that in order to head off Arab workers organizing themselves. They made sure that so it was kind of like, quote, what we used to call here separate but equal, you know. a separate organization of Arab workers, but always under the control of the Zionist labor movement. And
So the,
so
the
it
Zionist
sounds
labor
like
movement. Yeah.
so I'm wondering if there's not something similar to that with this new party that you're talking about.
I'm not sure. So first of all, I didn't know about the Labor Party, the Histadrut. That's actually the name of
Right. Yes.
the trade labor union movement that we still have now, which is actually a pillar of the state. It's not really an independent labor union. Um, I didn't know about them organizing Palestinians before 1948, perhaps, as a divide and rule policy against independent Palestinian unions. Um, I think that, well, perhaps you could say that this new party is a very soft attempt to co-opt Palestinian politics here in Israel. But the true equivalent here would be actually Likud inviting some Palestinian citizens of Israel to join the party. That's actually a thing. Or even some ultra-Orthodox parties, especially Shas, the one representing Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox Jews, forming good relations with some Arab or Palestinian politicians here within Israel, because especially when they control the Ministry of Interior, they control budgets. So there's a lot to be gained from good relations with this party. So I think that we're still seeing some more clumsy or heavy-handed attempts to co-opt Palestinian citizens of Israel by in a less liberal way. This new party, I'm not sure that the Jewish leaders of this party and the leaders, you have some Palestinian leaders. It's supposed to be kind of a joint initiative. I'm not sure that these the Jewish leaders within this party would sort of consciously see that as a co-optation attempt, but I would say that, yeah, I mean, such parties can easily be seen as an attempt to sort of pacify Palestinian resistance. And sometimes they tell Palestinians the so-called Arab parties are too extreme. You shouldn't support them. So there are various shades of co-optation here, and this new party could be a very soft form of co-optation.
Okay. So that kind of answers a lot of the questions that I had. I don't know if you have any final comments, Ofer.
No, probably no, not beyond my general message to Americans. Try to, I mean, let's try to work together. We have some things in common. And growing support for the anti-apartheid struggle in the US means the world to us. It's very, very important. Israeli decision makers and major supporters of Israel in the US are fearful of growing support for Palestinians in the US, and this is something we can all work on together.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Ofer, and look forward to
Sure.
talking again, especially after
Sure.
you, including after the ban that Facebook has imposed on you.
Yeah, a temporary ban due to some stupid AI decision, but in general, Facebook is not friendly towards pro-Palestine expression. Yeah, thanks.